Hello, hello. All right, I know we get that post-lunch blues where we're all got full tummies and we're feeling it, but hopefully you've got some caffeine or we're going to wake you up. And if you're not awake, you will be awake after this session. Our next speaker is coming from Black Kite, Jeffrey Wheatman. He is the SVP of Cyber Risk. And Jeff and I have a history. I worked with Jeff for many, many years. We were both Gartner analysts. We traveled the world running a lot of CISO forums, talking to a lot of investors, practitioners, and tech providers or vendors alike. And Jeff's going to deliver a really great presentation today on communications. Right? I'll butcher the title if I try to attempt to go through it. But I just want to give a little bit of background. Jeff and I, before we went into COVID, gave a similar presentation. I think this one is going to carry it on in spirit forward. We gave this to about 3,000 people, and it was about kind of communications, because communications, while can be a boring thing, or we might say, it's critical. It's absolutely critical when you're in cybersecurity, because cybersecurity is everywhere in the organization with any, which is every business today, digital businesses. So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Jeffrey Wheatman to the stage, and I hope all of you, I know you will enjoy it. Jeff, the stage is yours, my friend. Knock 'em dead.
Tavra, Asek, Ayak, Aha, Azimthar Yeri Czech. Is this on? I ambar na sinaths. Im turfil. Ha enen. Is this on? You guys hear me? So, before we get started, anyone who knows what those languages were, we have a little prize for you. And I have news for you. For those of you that are speaking to your business executives and your board, when you talk about cyber, that is what they hear. And we wonder why, when the economy turns, I know no one wants to say the R word just yet, but when the economy turns, they take your money, your budget, your people, because they don't really know what we do. I have spoken with hundreds of boards and thousands of security people who are getting ready to go in front of boards, and they're all talking different languages. So I love this quote. We use the words information and data and communication. We use them interchangeably, but they are not the same thing. Information is about giving out, telling. Communication is about getting through. It's about your message landing. It's about your audience understanding what you said and why. I actually had a conversation with a former colleague of mine last week, and my youngest daughter's getting ready to go off to college, and she's actually going to be majoring in French. And we were talking about what her career was going to be, and she says, I want to be a translator, but my friend Manish actually said she doesn't want to be a translator. She wants to be an interpreter between two languages. The words can be translated, but the meaning isn't. And that is a lot of what we're running up against. So before I tell you all kinds of good stuff that hopefully you will take back to work and leverage, and the good thing is you'll be able to leverage this stuff when you go back to the office, whether it's Wednesday or whether you told your boss that the conference is the whole week and you go back a week from Monday. And I won't tell either way. But prior to coming to Black Kite, as David mentioned, I spent 15 years at Gartner. And I've spoken with more than 50,000 people about how to be better, more effective communicators. I've briefed hundreds and hundreds of CISOs who are getting ready to go in front of the board. I reviewed board decks. I've worked with them on their approach, their story, their narrative. And I've been in front of more than 200 boards of directors to talk about cybersecurity and IT risk. My opinion, I think that makes me qualified to be able to guide people on this. Long back in my career, I was a practitioner. I did the job. I've done everything but coding and application development, and the world is a better place because I have not done those two things. So we used to ask people all the time, CISOs or security executives, do you think you are an effective communicator? And a whole bunch of them said yes. And then we went and we asked their bosses, do you think your CISO is an effective communicator? And they said no. So the reality is that the overlap between yes, we're effective and our bosses think we're effective is actually, the overlap is actually quite narrow. And if at the end of this session, we can squeeze that just a little bit today, I will consider my job done. So if you take away one thing, that's good. If you take away all the things, even better. But we have to move slowly but surely. You're not going to be Shakespearean actors and orators and writers and storytellers at the end of this presentation. But you will have tools to help you be more effective at communicating. So we're going to go through 4 little tips, groupings, different things that will help you be more effective. So the first one is you got to learn to speak the language of the business. They're not going to learn our language. We must learn theirs. And for us to expect them to learn ours is a failed, doomed exercise. Be a storyteller. We have a tendency to tell people everything we know. And I have news for you, and my wife tells me this all the time. No one is interested in hearing everything I know. And unfortunately, they're not interested in hearing everything you know either. Focus on the emotional impact and not on the ones and zeros and the data and the information. And then finally, understand your organization's appetite for risk. How much risk are they willing to accept? And we're going to go into all these in much greater detail. So the first thing is we need to learn to speak to business. Here's a very common conversation that takes place now. CFO, COO, CEO, whoever asks you, so tell me what our risks are. And you say, well, if we get hit with ransomware, our network is going to go down. So I'm going to tell you something. Your bosses, they don't know what a network is. They don't know why you need one, and they don't care if it goes down. But if instead you tell them, if we get hit with ransomware, we can't send out invoices. People can't pay us. We can't put product together and we can't ship it. We can't provide things that we have contracted to do. That they understand. This stuff, hackers, vulnerabilities, threats, nonsense, we all care about that. I care about it. I'm a geek at heart and I will always be a geek at heart. But this is the stuff they care about. Profit, revenue, share price. Some of my former colleagues at Gartner ran a project that I participated in before I left on what they called outcome-driven security. Now I'm going to paraphrase my friend Paul Proctor. Here is what your bosses care about. Number 1, money coming in, customers, retention, whatever. 2, money going out, expenses. How much are you spending as a company? And 3, and this one may be the most important one, if stuff goes sideways, who's getting in trouble? Those are the only 3 things they care about. Now, if you're in the public sector, money coming in may have different sort of interpretation, but at the end of the day, even if you're a public sector agency, you have objectives that you are committed to delivering on. That's your money coming in number. So what are some of the things you can do? So the first one's easy. You can take business classes. There are tons and tons of free resources out there and very inexpensive resources out there. The MIT Open Coursework Initiative has, I don't know, probably 100 or more thousand classes. You can learn how to read a P&L. You can learn how to read a general ledger. You can learn how accounting is done. You can read about things like mergers and acquisitions. Okay? Pilot your message. I guarantee you there is at least one person in your organization who does understand why security is important. So tell that person your story and listen to their feedback. If they're looking at their phone, they're not listening to you, and that means that your message is probably not delivering what you want. It's probably not landing. The third one, pause. Wait for a response. Don't talk over them. See whether it's registering with them, and I'll give you one that's not on here. Don't ever ask, anyone in your audience this question. Does that make sense to you? That is an incredibly insulting question, which I have asked thousands of people in my career until it was pointed out to me how insulting it is. Well, I understand this, you don't. But pausing allows you to read your audience. Now, as you may have picked up, I tend to talk kind of fast. So I put pauses in to allow everyone to digest. And I learned that actually in Brazil, because in Brazil, they do real-time translation. And after my first session in Brazil, they had to hold the translators away from choking me because I went so fast and I didn't stop, and I went from the beginning to the end. I did a 50-minute pitch in 19 and a half minutes, and they were way behind the entire time. So what does that mean? It means the audience didn't get the story because the translators were rushing. And as a follow-up, ask your audience, is this helpful to you? Is this the kind of information you're interested in hearing or seeing? Is there anything I can do with this information that will make it more useful? Before COVID, I was at an event in New York City, and they had a session at the end of the day. They had board members on stage talking about cybersecurity, and I asked them what I thought was a fairly straightforward question. I said, when your CISO, your CRO, your CIO comes to you and they tell you things you don't understand, are you sharing that with them? Hey, I don't know what that means. I don't know why you're showing me this, and I don't care. And all 5 board members scratched their head and said, no, but we probably should do that, shouldn't we? Right? Communication is a two-way channel. We can say all the things we want, and it can be perfect, but if your audience doesn't provide feedback, we need to ask them for feedback. And the last one is check your sources. How many of you have read something on the internet and shared it with somebody, and they go, oh, where'd you hear that? And you go, oh, I read it. But what was the original source? Where did that information actually come from? Unfortunately, the internet has become very self-fulfilling, and the sillier stories tend to be the ones that are the loudest, and those are the ones that get repeated. So I'll give you an example, right? So my dad, when I was a kid, told me a piece of trivia. He said $1 million in $1 bills, and I don't know if this would be true for Canadian because your money is lighter than ours, weighs 2,020 pounds. I cannot tell you how many times I have told people that, and do you know what? I have no idea whether it's even remotely true. But I talk with confidence, and no one has $1 million $1 bills to go away, so no one's going to call me out for being a liar. But before we start doing that, especially if we are asking for money or people, we need to make sure our sources are accurate. The second one, and this is probably my favorite one, is you have to learn how to tell stories. Once upon a time, those words resonate in every single culture in the world, in every single language in the world. I have delivered a version of this presentation well over 100 times to thousands of people. And when I say once upon a time, the hair still stands up on my arms, right? It's emotional. It gets you hooked. Most people don't think they're good at telling stories. Now, notice I didn't say most people are not good. They're self-doubting. They don't think they're telling stories, but they are. Some are better than others. Storytelling is actually quite simple, right? It's about conveying events in words and imagery so that you can do 1, 2, or even all 3 things: inform and educate, teach someone something they don't know. 2, influence a decision. You're thinking about doing this. Have you thought about this data? Maybe we want to look and change that decision. Or the third one, change people's behaviors. We've been doing this for a long time, and it doesn't really work that well anymore. Now, this is also tied to something else, which is a different topic altogether, but still useful. Why do we do this thing? Well, we've always done it that way before. So, quick story. I used to work with a client, and she told me one year at Easter, she was sitting around and she was prepping the ham, and she cut the ends off the ham and she put it in the pan, and her 9-year-old daughter said, "Mom, why did you cut the ends off the ham?" And Mom said, "I don't know, Grandma always used to do it." Let's go ask her. So they go over and they ask Grandma, "Hey, Gram, how come you always cut the ends off the ham?" She said, "I don't know. Nug Nug always used to do it. Let's go ask Nug Nug." So Nug Nug is the name they called their great-grandma. Don't ask, I just work here. But they go over to Nug Nug, and she's sitting in the corner, and she's drinking some Harvey's Bristol Cream Sherry. They go, Noog Noog, how come you always cut the ends off the ham? And you know what Noog Noog said? Well, we were poor. We only had one pan, and the ham didn't fit. So the daughter is cutting the ends off the ham for no good reason, because they got plenty of pans. So what are some of the things you can do to be better storytellers? The first one is super easy. Go watch movies. Good movies are good stories. If you don't have 2 hours, go watch some commercials. Commercials are good stories in 30 seconds. Build analogies, comparisons, finding things that resonate with your audience, and then use your stories to build on those metaphors. The third one, and this requires a little bit of work, but create your one-page story. Mark Twain had a great quote. He said, if you need a 3-hour speech, I'll have it ready for you by Thursday. If you need 15 minutes, I need 3 months to prepare. Right? Why? Because it's easy to tell everyone everything you know, but to distill it down to one page is not that easy. But it's very powerful because it forces you to focus on the things that are the most important. And I will tell you from experience, I have shared things with audiences and somebody says, why did you tell me that? And I don't have a good answer. So I probably shouldn't have told them that piece. So distill down your messaging, your ask, we need more money, budget, people, whatever. Distill that down to one pager, and it will force you to get right to the point, which is incredibly, incredibly powerful. And the last one is practice. Right? You can practice in front of the mirror to yourself. If you have a significant other who is nicer than mine, you can practice with them. I used to do my pitches to my kids, and my kids are a great audience. Why? Because they weren't really interested in hearing me talk in the first place, and they didn't know anything about what I was talking about. If I can tell a cybersecurity story to my 17-year-old daughter, it's a damn good story. So practice. You will fail sometimes, and that's okay. That's why the ask your audience from the last part is so important. Feelings do not equal facts. Because you believe something doesn't mean it's true. And we unfortunately see a lot of this right now in the political arena, right? Constituencies on opposite sides of the aisle, whatever side you're on, they believe their leaders are telling them the truth. They don't actually care whether they are. And that's true whether you're on the right or the left or in the middle. If we go and we talk about facts, we struggle sometimes. And there's a great study that was done a number of years ago. So researchers wanted to find out if an audience, a group, would give money to a charity based on emotions, based on facts, or some combination. So what they did was they went to a bunch of people and said, we'd like you to fill out this questionnaire. We're going to give you $15 for filling it out. And by the way, we're working on behalf of this charity that helps feed starving children in Africa. We'd like to know whether you would be interested in giving part or all of that $15 stipend to the charity. And they broke the group up into 3 different sections. One group was shown a picture of a child who looked like she missed a couple of meals. The second group was handed a data sheet filled with facts and figures about all the starvation in the world. Now, between those two, who thinks more people gave money with the picture? How many of you think more people gave money with the data sheet? Okay, those people would be incorrect. But here's where it gets interesting. For the third group, they gave them the picture and the data sheet. Now, who thinks, that was a loaded question because I wouldn't ask it if the answer was what we think. Who of you would say, yes, picture and word and data would get more than all of the other ones? You would think that, but in fact, that is not what happened. When they gave people the picture and the data, they got more than just the data, but less than just the picture. Why? Because the data undermines the humanity. Right? There's a great quote from history. One death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is the statistic. Okay. So thinking about that when you start to share these stories. Now, you don't want to just go to them and tell them the sky is falling, Chicken Little, and all that, but you do want to be able to mix in the emotional piece, right? So data may persuade people, but it doesn't inspire them to act, and that is what we want. We want people to act. I can stand up here and I can say, when I'm done, hopefully not before, but when I'm done, everybody gets to go out that door. Well, if nobody gets up out of their chair first, they don't act, they're not making it to that door. And this is a great quote, and what's interesting thing about this quote, right? So I remember I talked earlier about checking your sources. So this quote is frequently attributed to poet laureate Maya Angelou, but in fact, she did not say it. It was actually said by a social scientist named Carl Brunner. But the point is that it doesn't actually matter what you say because the feeling is there. Right? And the quote is very simple. People remember how they felt when you finished talking to them more than the stuff you told them. So before you go in and tell a story to your executives, how do you want them to feel when you're done? Do you want them to be afraid? Do you want them to be scared and joyous and happy? Do you want them to feel like you got it going on? Now, most security officers say they want their audience to be a little bit afraid, but confident in the CISO's ability to deliver. Okay, that's great. You got to build your story off of that. If you don't know what you want your audience to feel, how you want them to act, it's likely that your story's not going to land properly. And you want to know your audience. If your significant other likes romantic comedies and you keep taking them to Marvel movies or vice versa, they're going to stop going to the movies with you, and frequently they won't tell you why. They're just going, I don't want to go to the movies. So we need to make sure that we are hooking them with the right stories. So with this one, what do you want to do with this? So first, you can use data, but you want to be careful about it. Last week, I actually did a 2-day training, and they were talking about third-party risk metrics at the board, right? And the instructor said, well, you shouldn't have more than 20 or 30. And I literally jumped through the phone going, if you're showing your board 20 or 30 metrics on third-party risk management, they are kicking you out, and they are never inviting you back again. 3 or 4. Too many data points, people get overwhelmed. They don't want to be that way, right? For those of you who have kids, you know the biggest mistake you can make is give your little kids 5, 6, 7 options. Give them 2. You want the chicken or the hamburger? So you can use data, but you got to be careful about how you use it, and you have to think, why are we showing them this data? The second thing, you want to know your audience's triggers. You want to know what's important to them, right? So I mentioned earlier talking about, well, ransomware brings down the network. Okay. But when you're talking to someone in sales, what's going to trigger them? Having their sales go down or not being able to deliver and having to refund their customers. When you're talking to a COO, they're going to look at operational efficiencies. They're going to look at operational impact. They don't necessarily care directly about the sales. I mean, at the end, everybody cares about sales. But you want to make sure you know what's important. You want to pilot your messages. So this is a little bit different than finding someone who understands what you're trying to get to. You do want to focus a little bit on those kinds of things, but small pieces, little bits and pieces. Give them one data point and a little snippet to go with it, and then you can start to build all that stuff together. So for those of you that are fans of stand-up comics, all comics have different ways that they write. So Jerry Seinfeld is a comic that I think he has a very interesting process. He gets up on stage and he tells a joke. And then he gets up on stage and he changes one word in that joke. And he does that over and over and over until he is able to craft the perfect joke. Now he does this in front of 50 audiences. We don't have that. We generally have 2, 3, 4 audiences if we're lucky. So you want to be careful. You want to hit the key things, and then you want to find some kernels that are landing and then build around that. The fourth one is look for hot buttons. If your CEO's main objective is to do Project XYZ, you better be focusing on the risks specifically around that project. You want to make sure that, number one, you are not killing it off because of some perceived risk that may be real, but not for them, or that you are putting risks out there that will cause decisions to be made that will go against what the CEO wants you to do, or the COO or the CFO, whatever. But you want to make sure you're hitting those hot buttons. Some other hot buttons, if somebody in your industry has had an issue, either a ransomware attack or some other kind of technology operational thing, you definitely want to use those as leverage. Again, hey, I know you saw this happen to this company. I don't think we want that to happen here. So let's talk about how we can prevent that. Right? Focus on those kinds of things. And then this last one I think is very powerful. It's a little bit of a challenge. So my friend and colleague, Aaron Connolly, is sitting in the audience over there. And back in November, he and I did scenario planning for our executive leadership team. How many of you have ever done scenario planning in your organizations? Okay, a couple of you. So this will resonate with you. When you do scenario planning, the first hour, people go, "What are you talking about? I don't care. Go away. Why are you bothering me?" And then in hour 2, they start to go, "Oh, okay, I get this." And then by the time you get to the 3rd and 4th hour, and these things are generally half-day exercises, everybody's moving in the same direction. Now, I've run a bunch of these, and I've watched a bunch of them, and it's amazing how, no matter how all over the place everybody is up front, by the end, everybody's moving in the same direction. It's beautiful to watch. And it's often that. So if you're interested in talking about scenario planning, feel free to grab me after I'm done, or you can come by our booth. This is one of my favorite topics. I love to talk to people about it. But scenario planning, very simply, is let's figure out what could the future look like for us, and if it did look like that, what would we do, right? Hey, we're going to hit the Great Depression, or what economic downturn, as an example. So you lay those out and then you talk about extremes. Scenario planning, the way I do it, was created by a guy who used to work for Shell Oil. He was the director of global strategic planning. And in the 1970s, and I think some of you are probably at my age or close to my age, so you remember the Arab oil embargo. Well, he went to the executive team and said, "This is a scenario we should plan for." And the board said, "Well, that'll never happen." And Mr. Schwartz said, "Well, what if it did?" Shell Oil was the only global oil company that did not run out of oil during the embargo as a result of scenario planning. Scenario planning leads itself to stories. Stories, as I said, are very powerful ways to get people to think differently. And the last thing we're going to talk about is this concept of risk appetite or risk tolerance. The terms are frequently used interchangeably, but at the end of the day, it's very much about how much risk is your organization willing to accept. Now, the way I define risk appetite, and you don't have to necessarily use the same definition, is how much risk is your organization seeking? And notice I say seeking because that's an important thing. If we take no risks, we have no business, we have no agency, we have no raison d'entrée. We must understand that seeking out risk is part of any business. Right? You want to do global expansion? What's the risk? Well, we're putting salespeople in a foreign region. Or the opportunity risk, we're not putting salespeople where we're already successful, right? Now, this is a very, very delicate balancing act. There is a line above which the risk is too much. There is a line below which there is not enough. Now, keep in mind, not taking enough risk can be just as bad and sometimes even worse than taking a risk. So it's a balancing act, and you guys are at the fulcrum of that balancing act. So you want to start to have conversations with your organization about organizational goals and objectives. There was some survey data recently published, say about 6 months ago. Board members have indicated that they believe over the next 24 months they are going to shift their risk appetite up, meaning they are going to be willing to take more risk. Why? Because there's less opportunity. If the economy turns, businesses may have to be more risky in order to keep the lights on. And we saw a lot of that when COVID hit. People sent their folks home with old laptops that weren't patched anymore because if they didn't do that, they had no business. Right? Think about what scale you want to use. You want to make sure your senior executives are involved. You don't want to tell them what their risk appetite is. You want to find out what it is by telling stories and asking questions. Use a common language. The taxonomy and the terminology needs to be the same. Everyone needs to hear the same thing when you say risk, when you say threat, when you say operations. And don't even get me started about how that mismatch is so prevalent in our industry. And then create processes and tools to be able to prioritize. Which risks are more important? Which ones do we want to go after? Right? To badly misquote Animal Farm by George Orwell, all risks are equal. Some risks are more equal than others. So let's focus on the ones that are more equal than others. So first thing you can do in order to move this forward is does your organization need a risk appetite? And the answer is generally yes. There are exceptions, very small organizations, it may just be so inherent in the executive team you don't have to think about it. But you should ask this question, and you should ask how much detail you want. I ran a workshop, I've run a bunch, but the first workshop I ran on this for an insurance company, an hour in, I realized there were 3 groups of people and they were all talking about entirely different things. Well, no wonder you don't have a risk appetite program, because you have 3 different stakeholder groups, all of whom are doing the different things. Get the terminology and the taxonomy. Remember, again, the language is very, very important. When I was in consulting, I used to walk into meetings and I would say, here are the 5 terms I'm going to use during the project. Here are my definitions. I don't care if you agree, but when I use them, you better understand. Because I realized I couldn't do that. I couldn't figure out what every organization I did work for used. And then finally, you want to make sure that your risk appetites are linked to organizational objectives. If you tell people, well, we need to not let people install their own software on a computer because the computers will crash, nobody cares about that. But if you say, we need to keep people up so they can support our customers, and if we don't do this, that will not happen, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. So just to close with a couple of recommendations, and I'll be happy to stick around if anyone has any questions. So first, learn the language of your business. They're not going to learn yours. Second, tell stories. There's a ton of great research out there. The interesting thing is I have presented to thousands and thousands of people, and I've done hundreds of presentations, and I've gotten perfect scores 1 time. And that was on the first deck I did on telling stories at one of the Gartner conferences. 400 people in the audience, every single one of them gave me a 5. Why? Because it's something that no one was talking about. Now everybody's talking about. Third thing, yes, you have data, facts, and figures, but step away from them and make sure that when you use them, they are used with purpose. And then finally, work with your business executives so you understand their appetite for risk. How much is not enough? How much is too much? If we don't understand what their risk appetite is, what their risk tolerance is, we're going to be making decisions essentially at random, because they're going to say, well, that's a security decision. You have to make that. And that may or may not be true, but if you make it without understanding their impact, you're going to fail. Real quick story before I finish up. A bunch of years ago, I was sitting in the office for a CISO for a company that managed a bunch of healthcare facilities. And we're sitting in there and we're having a conversation, and the door slams open, and a doctor comes in. He's wearing scrubs, and he's got blood all over him. And he starts screaming at the CISO. Why? Well, they put a policy in place that said any computer that has not been used for 90 seconds, a screensaver pops up. Well, I have news for you. There are computers in the operating room and nobody touches them. The guy was impatient and his screen went off. He didn't understand, the CISO didn't understand the appetite for risk. So again, thank you very much. Feel free to reach out and contact me, whether it's about this or anything else. If you want to talk, we are at, what booth are we at, Kyle? A15, so right next to Microsoft. Right, we're actually blocking the door to make sure everybody comes. So with that, I want to thank you very much. I don't really have any time for questions, but I will jump off stage and I'm happy to take questions if anyone has. Thank you.